Thank you very much, Chanel. That's a really good title graphic you've got there. Yes, this is our fifth presentation today at our 2023 Sea Otter Science Symposium. This one is Lessons from Haida Gwaii, how the return of sea otters can change coastal ecosystems. We know that sea otters like to eat shellfish, yet there is so much more that can change. Sea otters stimulate changes to these coastal ecosystems that are both visible and invisible, and that change over time, whether from a few years to decades after they return. So it's always a work in progress. Dr. Lynn Lee is an ecologist team leader for Parks Canada, focusing on the Haida Gwaii Haanas National Marine Conservation Area and Haida Heritage Site. She works closely with the Haida Nation to lead an interdisciplinary team initiative entitled Nurturing Seafood to Grow, Mimicking Sea Otter to Restore Kelp in Gwaii Haanas. She will share with us her observations and lessons from the return of sea otters in the ecology of nearshore kelp ecosystems. I would also say welcome back, Lynn. You shared your knowledge with us at our 2021 symposium, and we look forward to an update from you today. So you may share screen and go for it.
Okay, great. Thanks for the intro, Bob. And hi, everyone. I'm up in Tallel on Haida Gwaii. My bandwidth on the internet is not awesome, so I'm going to leave my video off when I give the presentation, just so it doesn't get too glitchy. Share screen. Thanks for joining, everyone, and for persevering through many presentations. And actually, what's nice about this is a nice segue from the last conversation. I just heard the end of the discussion from the last talk, and why is it not working? Okay, can you see my screen? Yeah, okay, so then if I go like this, oops, sorry, that it was supposed to be, sorry, it was supposed to be at the start, not in the middle of the presentation. Here we go, one moment. Okay, now can you see something that says Lessons from Haida Gwaii?
Yes, I do.
Yes,
okay, perfect.
Yes,
okay, so if there are any questions along the way, feel free to interrupt, and if they're in the chat, because I can't see anything. And so, as Bob said, I'm going to give you a little update on our Nurturing Seafood to Grow Chihu till iinasdll kelp restoration project, which, because it mimics sea otters and sea otter foraging on urchins in particular, I think some of the lessons that we learned from there and the research work that we did is gives us some insight into the kind of changes that we expect to see when sea otters come back naturally in the ecosystem. And I just want to say, first of all, normally this talk I would give with my Council of the Haida Nation co-lead, Dan McNeil or Vanessa Bellis, and also our academic lead, Dan Okamoto, and Tim Tinker is also someone you're all familiar with, who worked with us on the Sea Otter project. So the first part of my talk will be about the kelp restoration work, and the second part will be a little bit about the sea otter, returning of sea otters to Haida Gwaii work that we've done also co-leading with the Haida Nation. And so if I can get my screen to go, there we go. So these projects, because we're on Haida Gwaii and in this unique situation where Gwaii Haanas is cooperatively managed between the Council of Haida Nation and Government of Canada, all of our work is rooted in Haida ethics and values. And so we have a land sea people plan for Gwaii Haanas and also a marine plan for all of Haida Gwaii, and that's rooted in these same guiding principles based on Haida ethics and values and Haida law. So these projects are co-led by Council of the Haida Nation and Parks Canada Gwaii Haanas. They also involve our other management partner, Fisheries and Oceans, and many other partners that are not with government agencies. And so we built these partnerships to foster innovation and sustainability, including talking with commercial fishermen and having commercial fishermen and fishing associations as direct partners in the project, and really key to the successes of the project. And so we were looking at trying to achieve ecological, cultural, and social objectives together. And so these Haida ethics and values are the guiding principles, and they include respect, balance, responsibility, interconnectedness, giving and receiving, and seeking wise counsel. And also because of the nature of co-management and just recognizing more and more that science is not the only way that people know about the system, and that there's local knowledge, and there's Haida and First Nations knowledge that has been ongoing for millennia in terms of understanding and observations of the ecosystem that are equally as important as scientific knowledge. And so bringing all of those together provides a strong foundation for innovation, and it provides a richer, broader perspective. And we liken it to the weavings of spruce root and cedar baskets. These are Haida designs and baskets, of course. And so bringing all those knowledge systems together really lends us a lot more to work with, and a much broader perspective by which to make decisions and plan. And so, as Bob said, we're mimicking sea otter predation on urchins to restore kelp. And I don't need to go through all of these things that all of you will know full well in terms of the importance of kelp for cultural, social, and ecological relationships. And also that kelp has been found to foster resilience to climate change, including a lot of carbon cycling and sequestration, and resilience to low oxygen and acidification. And of course, it also provides a lot of very important habitat for species that are important to people and local biodiversity. And so here is a before COVID shot of people working together in the Nurturing Seafood to Go project. So we had the project team working in the summer between the Council of Haida Nation, academics, universities, and Fisheries and Oceans. And then we had work with the Fishing Industry Association, often in the spring and the fall when the fishing was actually happening on island. And so there were over 200 people that were involved in working on this project. The key organizations are across the top: the 3 management partners in Gwaii Haanas, the Pacific Urchin Harvesters Association, Haka Institute, and then 4 universities. And the importance of working with the academics meant that we could learn a lot more about the ecosystem, and especially the invisible changes that we would not otherwise have been able to do ourselves. And so for those who don't dive, I suspect many people are divers or snorkelers, but just a very quick overview of forests on land and sea, because we can relate to walking through the forest on land, and people who haven't been underwater may not be able to relate to the kelp forest, but it's pretty much very similar and analogous to the kind of structure that you see. So there are tall tree-like kelps that are the bull kelp and giant kelp in our system. And then there's a whole slew of understory kelps that are more like the shrub and herb layers. And then all the smaller seaweeds that are not kelps that are smaller and cover the bottom of the ocean as well. And so you can see in these pictures the fish. I didn't have birds in the forest, but birds would be the analogous to fish in the ecosystem underwater. And so the big difference is that on land, these forests can live to hundreds and even 1,000 years old for a red cedar, but the turnover of kelp and individual plants of kelp is much faster underwater. And so there are annuals and perennials, but the perennials don't live more than 30 years. And the longest kelp is one called Pterogophora, and I think it's been aged at about 27. So that's a lot different than, an order of magnitude different than hundreds of years and even 1,000 years. So when you look at trees, you can age them, as we all know, and this is just a young alder, but you can do the same thing with some of these older kelps. So this is a Pterogophora, where we cut a thin sliver of the bottom of the stipe of one that had died naturally. And you can see that there are growth rings that you can count, and they give you a sense of how old that kelp is as well. And you can do the same thing with fish. And so the interesting thing about fish, like rockfish, the oldest living fish likely underwater is a rockfish. It's a species called a rough-eye, and there was one aged at 205 years. So that's pretty amazing. And when you think about birds on land, I think the oldest bird, if you believe Google, is the Laysan albatross, and it was aged at 69 years in the wild. So parrots can live up to 100 when they're in captivity, but in terms of wild birds, they don't live more than 100 years. So fish are pretty amazing. This copper rockfish and black rockfish you see in the picture, those are even 50 years old. The ubiquitous red snapper, what people call red snapper, is a yellow eye, and the yellow eye can be 118 years. And then at the bottom there is the rough eye, which is 205 years. And they age them with the otolith, just like a tree ring. So that otolith is at the sort of the middle bottom of my screen. You can see the cursor, and you can read these. They can cut right through the middle of this otolith and then use the growth rings that are seasonal to look at how old that fish is. So it's very tedious work because that otolith is an ear bone that's in the fish and not very large. Now, in the forests on Haida Gwaii, we have an introduced deer. That's the big herbivore. And because there's not really a big natural predator of deer, we have hyperabundant deer. And in the same way, we have hyperabundant grazing urchins underwater, but the urchins are native to here. They're not introduced. And they have this jaw part called an Aristotle's lantern, which is a very crunchy, very good at biting all kinds of things, very sharp. And so it goes along the bottom and they graze the bottom free of kelp and algae. And so you can see here, these are pictures from Haida Gwaii of the 3 key species that are in the shallows for urchins. To the left are the red urchins, and then there's also a purple urchin climbing up the stipe of bull kelp that has managed to survive. And then a carpet of purple urchins and a carpet of green urchins from the central coast of BC. So you can see our system right now is very hyper abundant in urchins, and it's because of lots of the sea otter. And I'm not sure if your other presenters have already talked about this, but just very briefly, because of the maritime fur trade from the 1700s to the mid 1800s, we lost this big predator. And so essentially for over 10,000 years, there was a relationship between Haida, sea otters, shellfish, kelp, and coastal ecosystems in these blue arrows where people and sea otters maintained a system where there were where all of these components of the ecosystem were around, and there were much more extensive kelp forests overall because sea otters would keep invertebrates, especially urchin grazers, in check through a lot of Haida Gwaii. And so we imagine that there was this mosaic of places where Haida would have hunted sea otters more intensively, and those areas would have had less kelp and more shellfish, and then other areas where there would be more otters and then more kelp. And so in this very short period of about 50 years of the maritime fur trade, we essentially extirpated the sea otter. And that happened 100 to 200 years ago, depending where you are on the coast. And so this led to a release of their invertebrate prey from the predation pressure of sea otters and an increase in their numbers to the hyperabundance that we see today. And so even in 1877, George Dawson, when he was visiting a place in southern Haida Gwaii and Gwaii Haanas, he says below high water mark in some places, the large urchins are very thickly strewn over the bottom. And so even in 1877, he was describing what we would know as urchin barrens today. So these changes have happened a long time ago. And so this system of hyperabundant invertebrates is what's driving a lot of commercial fisheries today. And it has become a source of conflict in terms of sea otter return. And so when you have a system that have sea otters present, you have a lot of green, there's a lot of kelp, and it's not that there are no invertebrates, they're there, but they're hiding in the kelp, they're under the crevices, and so it's harder to find them. And then when sea otters are absent, as we have on most of Haida Gwaii now, then you get this very distinct urchin barren, and the kelp exists, but the kelp is kind of relegated to this shallow habitat that's close to the zero tide line or where there's lots of wave action. They'll be a bit deeper, but not very far into the water. And then you get this line of urchins. And incredibly, after you remove those urchins, if there is a source of kelp, and if conditions for kelp growing are good, then you can see recovery of kelp quite quickly after sea otters move in, or after, in our case, the urchin removal project. And so the context of where we are today now, because of the maritime fur trade and loss of sea otters, is that we have this loss of First Nations access to abalone, and I'll tell you more about that in terms of the commercial fishery. We have sea otters that are now listed as special concern because of the reintroduction, and now their populations are growing in British Columbia. And we also have northern abalone, which are still considered endangered, although in the last 10 years, their populations have started to rebound a bit. And so looking at this in the context of a timeline, you can see the last 10,000 plus years, we expect that overall we had more kelp and more sea otters and less abalone and urchins that were the prey items of sea otters. And in this brown block here is the less than 50 years of the maritime fur trade, in which over 361,000 sea otter pelts were traded. And so this is that steep decline, the brown line, going down to almost nothing by the early 1800s. And then until the reintroduction here in 1969 to 72, there were pretty much no otters on the coast, and they were ecologically extirpated. In the meantime, because of the lag from lack of predation to recruitment and survival and all of those things that happen with invertebrates, then abalone and urchin numbers started to rise. And as urchin numbers were rising, they would start eating more kelp, and the kelp extent would fall. So these things are lags in the system. They don't happen right away, but this loss of sea otters creates this situation where over time, shellfish become much more abundant. They become hyperabundant, and then this starts to drive these commercial fisheries as salmon was declining and other fisheries were looking for new and different species to fish. And so in a very short period of 20 years, this orange block here, we fished the abalone stocks in British Columbia to the point where they were less than 75 to 85% of what was there before. They were considered threatened, and the fishery was closed in 1990. And at the same time, sea otter populations were starting to recover. So all of these changes are happening at the same time and all confounding in terms of their effects on coastal ecosystems and on people. And so I just want you to look at this brown bar and this orange bar and remember those for this next slide, which then superimposes the context in terms of governance and ecological regime in terms of the fur trade time, maritime fur trade, and also the abalone fishery. And so there's this governance context of First Nations Indigenous governance for over 10,000 years that eventually gets superseded by a whole bunch of settler Canadian federal law, colonization, potlatch bans, and a whole bunch of smallpox and disease and reduction in First Nations populations to the point where eventually our system is where it is today, which is federally dominated. And at the same time, here's the sea otter situation where the ecological regime is the loss of sea otters for this whole period where we have a change from Indigenous to federal governance, and then this commercial fishery, which was a very short-lived thing, but also happening at the same time that sea otters were being reintroduced on the coast. And so now we're in this period of abalone recovery. We're also in this period of sea otter recovery. And importantly, we're also in this period of redefining governance and power in terms of First Nations and colonial governments. And so it's all intertwined and very complicated and interconnected. So this is sort of the context by which Haida Gwaii we work on in Haida Gwaii. And so these projects, in this case, was looking at restoring reciprocal relationships among people in place. So making sure that people are an integral part of the ecosystem and not considered outside of the ecosystem because they have been part of this place and have been part of its functioning for a very long time. And so we all know kelp is ecologically and culturally important. This is herring spawn. Inang is herring in Haida. And this is showing milting from herring spawn. And of course, giant kelp is an important substrate that herring like to lay their eggs on. And it also turns out that it's also a very important food source called gao, or herring roe on kelp. And to the left, you can see pictures of traditional harvests with lines where kelp is hung. And then when the herring come in, they lay the eggs on the kelp. And then some of the kelp, when it's thinner, when the egg coverage is thinner, it gets dried, and they're called dryers. And so there you can see someone hanging all the kelp up for storing for food later. And then also kelp is also ecologically and culturally important for fish and invertebrates. And so these are just some of the fish species that depend on kelp forests: kelp greenlings, black rockfish, lingcod, all kinds of other nearshore rockfish. And then the juveniles of many species of rockfish, salmon, and also herring depend on kelp forests. So those are just some of the key species that depend on kelp forests. One thing to highlight for everyone is like this restoration is happening within the Gwaii Haanas National Marine Conservation Area and Haida Heritage Site, which is protected and has strict protection zones where no commercial and recreational fishing is allowed. And the work that we're doing for kelp restoration is actually in one of these zones. And it's because it was identified as previously identified as an important abalone area. And abalone recovery is one of the things that we were focusing on promoting with kelp restoration. And so our Archipelago Management Board, which is the co-management board for the area, approved opening of part of this area for commercial fishing, urchin fishing in particular, so that we could work with industry to see if there were ways that they could help us maintain the site, and also see if there were fishing strategies that could help us restore kelp. And one of the key things that we have here is that this fishery only can occur if it's monitored by a Haida Fisheries Guardian. And so for the last 4 years now, we've been able to implement, except for 1 year because of COVID, we've been able to implement this maintenance work. So it's been pretty cool. And So just a brief overview of what we did. So this is us working in pre-restoration surveys in 17 and 18, and then we did post-restoration work between 2019 and 21, and then continuing monitoring work in 22 and 23. And so this is just some pictures of the crew, Haida Fisheries crew working, some of the academic and Gwaii Haanas crew, and then underwater pictures of people working together and the ecosystem. And so we did this restoration work by removing urchins and in 3 ways. So we brought urchins into the community when we could in a Haida traditional fishery. If it was possible, if the urchins were good enough quality, some of them went to the commercial market. And then for the most part, I would say the majority of urchins we had to crack in situ. And that's because they are in the barrens and they don't have enough food, so they're not worth harvesting and there's not a lot of roe. And so in summary, we treated about 3 kilometers of coastline between 0 and 15 meters depth. It took about 150 diver days. So that's a lot of divers and vessels, 6 commercial vessels, 1 Haida Fisheries vessel, and we removed about 500,000 urchins or cracked them and reduced the urchin density by about 90% over the course of the 2 intensive harvests. In future years, in the springtime, there's a fishery, an urchin fishery that comes to work every March and April. And so we worked with fishing industry representatives to have a select number of vessels. So they have to be volunteer vessels who are certified through the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan to fish in this, what we call a supplemental fishery, ahead of when the regular fishery opens. And so for the last 4 years, there have been about 5 or 6 commercial vessels monitored by a Haida Fisheries vessel and about 50 diver days, and an additional 200,000 urchins have been removed or cracked at the site since then to maintain the site because the otters are not there yet. And some of this food went into the community. So we had classroom lessons with the schools where kids got to learn how to crack and to eat urchin roe, which is called Gwaay in Haida, a farm to school program for lunches, and then community distribution and outreach where we brought urchins into the community because the urchins are far enough away that people without vessels and without boats can get to them very easily. And so this is a little insight into what we saw. So here's pre-restoration drone footage showing just a few pieces of kelp. You can count the individual stipes there before the work, and then these are the same areas after the work was done. So this is 9 months after the following summer, and you can see this flush of bull kelp that's come in because the spores were there and settled and water conditions were good. It was a very successful first year after the restoration work, and this is briefly what it looked like underwater before restoration and then after. So this is the stuff that you're seeing from the surface, the very young bull kelp, and then a lot of this weedy desmarestia. Oops, sorry. See, I'm in a loop. Let me go forward. Okay, there we go. So kelp restoration change. This is a representation of how much kelp we had in 2017 and 18 in terms of the canopy kelp. And then this 2019 is what you were seeing in the aerial photos. So about 3 times more bull kelp canopy than we had before. But then in the following 2 years of monitoring, it kind of didn't look very good. So we went to 1.5 and then the same amount of kind of canopy bull kelp as we had in 2018. So this was a little discouraging. Urchins were still down, but then in 2022 and 23, we were back to higher diversity at more than 3 times the amount of kelp canopy and deeper kelp than we saw even in 2019. So in 2020 and 21, I think this had a lot to do with water conditions, and these were all warm years, and it didn't start really cooling down until 2021, 22. So I think these cooler waters here were good for kelp recruitment in those years. 2022 right now has been the highest diversity and highest number of kelp plants that have come back. And then just this past summer, we were back there again and it's still looking pretty good, but now little green urchins have moved in. And so this is where, as Aaron's work showed, the loss of the sunflower star has really affected their survival has been much greater than it was when there were lots of sunflower stars around. So the ecosystem, as we all know, is super dynamic, and it's kind of fascinating and lots to learn from continuing to monitor what's happening at the site. And so here's our restoration work in terms of graphs. The thing to note is the control sites are all pretty much the same in terms of red urchin and abalone densities. And then here's where we took out 90% of the urchins. You can really see these are 3 depth zones, so shallow, mid, and deep. And you can see we knocked back the urchins everywhere along the site. And then you can also see that in spite of maintenance work, there's still urchins that are marching up from the deep. So this light pink line is the deeper line, and the darker solid line is the shallow line. So in 2022, you can see that the densities that were 0 earlier on, that those urchins are moving back into the shallows as well. And so that is an ongoing maintenance issue that we work with the commercial industry to try and address. And then in terms of abalone are highly mobile. And so when we were doing the work, they were not very happy about being in the area. And so they took off here and here, and the densities right after the work were quite low. But because they're so mobile, they came back after the kelp started growing. And this, I think, is the consequence of having more food because abalone need lots of kelp to stay happy. And so we're seeing this increase in abalone and also a slight increase in urchins. That is part of our maintenance work. And in terms of kelp recovery, so the arrows are where we did the restoration work. And again, the big thing to note is that in the mid and deep, there was almost nothing before the restoration work was done in the understory kelps. And then after the work was done, the understory kelps maintained a higher density, much higher than before. And this is a log scale, so it's quite significant. And then the other part of the story is that this bull kelp, you can see, is highly variable at the control site and also highly variable at the restoration site. So the canopy can be quite a bit more variable than what we see in the understory. And then just a couple of quick slides about the seaweed diversity change. So we looked also at the smaller seaweeds that require a lot of expertise to identify, and basically found higher abundance and diversity and richness of seaweeds at the restoration site, and also saw a different seaweed community at the restoration site compared to the control site. So all of these things are a consequence of less urchin grazing. So those are all the structural things that we can see. And so I'm going to go into some of the invisible changes that we can't see. This picture, just so you know, is from one of the places where sea otters are moving back in. So you can see this nascent bull kelp bed coming in, and you can still see that there are lots of urchins because we only have a few otters in the area. So it takes time, but we're basically seeing the real-time change from a system without otters to one that has otters, and it's pretty cool. Okay, so marketability of urchins. So really that's how much roe is in the urchin. And at the edge of the kelp, these are the guys that you really want to harvest. If you're a commercial fisherman, you're fishing here, and you're also fishing at the drift kelp line if there's a deeper drift kelp line, and you get this lovely looking roe, which is what you want. But deeper in the barrens, most of the urchins look like this. So they either have nothing in them or very little, or it's kind of black and brown colored, and it's not marketable at all. And so that's the reason why we had to crush most of the urchins that were deeper. So more kelp equals more gonads for these guys. And so did our restoration efforts lead to marketable urchins and assist abalone recovery? So the first question, this is the control site. So you can see pre is in red and post restoration is in blue. So there's no change at the control site for either the shallow or the deep edge of the kelp or barrens. But if you look at the treatment site, there's no difference in the shallow because that they still had kelp in the shallows, even when it was an urchin barren. And it's in the deep of these areas that we really see the difference. And so there was a big increase in the gonad weight in the deep barrens area, because now these animals are getting kelp. Even if there's no kelp living in the deeper part of the kelp forest, the shallower kelp is feeding those urchins as well. So there's a lot more drift in the system that urchins can eat. And I can attest to this lovely looking roe here. We had some for dinner, and it was probably the sweetest roe that I've had in terms of red urchin roe. And so what do they eat in the barrens versus the kelp forest? This is work that Aaron Galloway, who is talking about Pycnopodia, is doing, and he's one of our collaborators. You are what you eat, essentially. And so if you saw his talk, you'll know that these things that you eat turn into fatty acid biomarkers that you can then use to trace what kind of food you were eating. And so these urchins from the barrens and kelp forest in the purple are the ones from the barrens, and in the green are the kelp forest. And as you would expect, there's more bacteria, oh, sorry, it's the opposite. The barrens is in purple, or sorry, in green, and the barrens is, or the kelp is in purple. I'm not sure why it's that way. And so bacterially derived kelp or bacterially derived fatty acids are more common in the barrens, and brown algae and green algae are less common in the barrens. So it's what you would expect it to be. But I have this legend wrong, so ignore that. And then we also see from our restoration work that we have an increase in brown algae, which is kelp fatty acids in the restoration urchins. And you can see this in mostly the deep site and also a little bit in the shallow part of the site. And so the deep urchins definitely gained in the amount of kelp fatty acids. So they were definitely eating more kelp. And so we also looked at how these urchins and abalone persist in the barrens, and you can actually measure individual respiration rates. You can put these guys in individual chambers, and this is the work of Dan Okamoto and his grad student Nate Spindle, who's just finishing up his PhD. And so you hook these urchins up to a computer that, and the sensors measure oxygen and CO2, so you can measure the respiration rate of the urchins in that chamber. And so when you do that, what you find is that the respiration rate of those urchins at the edge of the kelp is much higher than those that are deeper in the barrens. And so it's actually a 50% decline in respiration rate in the barrens, and what we term metabolic depression, and what media has sometimes termed zombies. But they basically can shut down their metabolism when they don't have enough food. So it's pretty amazing. And then the other interesting thing is that abalone are exactly the opposite. So abalone have this giant foot, which requires a lot of energy. And when they don't have enough food, they have to run around in the barrens, this purple line, and they have to look for food. So they're using more energy than when they have lots of food where they can hunker down and just eat. And so this is why you find abalone packed at the kelp line like this, because they really need that kelp food when they're older. And so everybody's trying to get into the shallows. And we've been able to use some cool acoustic technology that are acoustic tags on these abalones to help us track the little animals. And so this is some preliminary data from a couple of years ago. In 2 weeks, these are the little trails of the abalone moving, and this is 50 meters from here to here. And so some of these guys are moving quite a long ways in just 2 weeks, and then other guys are hunkering down. And our hypothesis is that these guys have enough food where they are, so they don't have to go very far, but these guys are probably looking around and scouring the bottom of the barrens looking for more food. And also urchins are fascinating because they can be in complete metabolic depression and not have any roe, but as soon as you give them food, kelp food, then they start to grow roe. And within a month, their metabolic rate increases significantly, regardless of whether they came from the barrens or the kelp. So urchins are very, very reactive to their ecosystem. And then we can also measure the growth rates and the gonad change in these urchins by looking at the jaw part. So this is one of the 5 parts of the jaw called the Aristotle's lantern. And you inject underwater these urchins with tetracycline, which is the antibiotic, and tetracycline glows under black light. So this is this glowing line here. And what you have to do is take the urchins that were tagged in the area. You can't tell whether they're tagged until you crack them open and look at the jaws under black light. And when you look at them under black light, if they're tagged, they glow yellow like this. And then you can collect those urchins, measure their test diameter, and then use the difference between where you tag the urchin and a year later when you recovered that urchin. And that is the growth between the year of tagging and the following year. And so you can develop these growth curves and look at their growth rates. And so the upshot of all of that is that these 6 to 9 centimeter urchins are the ones that benefit the most from having kelp. So when they don't have kelp in the barrens, then they grow up to 40% slower. But the other interesting thing is that the urchins that have the greatest gonad production the greatest difference is in these large urchins. So the growth is here, but the gonads are here. So these large 8 to 13 centimeter urchins really need that kelp if they're going to grow roe and be marketable. And so all of this gives us kind of insight into possible alternative strategies for how we might put in sustainable urchin fishing practices that could also help restore kelp. So a couple of things to think about. We are looking at red urchins, but other urchin species like these purple urchins and green urchins have much higher recruitment rate, and they're also not as long lived. A red urchin can live up to 200 years. And so those other species may behave differently, the barons of these other species, than the red urchins. And then the other thing is that warming and acidification increase urchin feeding. And so these experiments with mesocosms in more acidic and higher temperature conditions are basically showing that as ocean acidification happens and as ocean warming happens, the feeding rate of urchins increases. And so the same number of urchins could end up basically eating more kelp. Oh, sorry, the dog. Sorry about that. This is not my work, but work from the west coast of Vancouver Island, showing, hang on one second. Sorry, you guys, my neighbor is running up the road with an excavator. This is what happens when you live in the, hang on one sec, I'm gonna go somewhere else. Okay, so this I just wanted to show because it also shows some difference in community change that we didn't measure in our kelp restoration project. So on the west coast of Vancouver Island, Rebecca Martone and Russ Markel worked at looking at different sites with different sea otter occupation times, from no sea otters to less than 5 years and then greater than 20 years. And so they tracked these sites showing an increase in the amount of kelp forest fish, small crabs, small grazers, and then kelps. So there's not as much studied, and there's a lot of work that could be done in terms of the response of fish. And so Russ's work on the west coast of Vancouver Island also showed the same thing, and extrapolated that you could get 46 times more rockfish when sea otters were in the system. And he also found an increase in the genetic diversity and an increase in the rockfish trophic levels. Okay, so incredible ecosystem response over a very short time frame and the ensuing 4 years, because we've been able to maintain the site at our restoration site. But as we've discussed, there's lots of factors that will determine whether this succeeds over the long term. Okay, so then I'm going to quickly go through just a few slides to show you about our 3-year project looking at the return of sea otters to Haida Gwaii. So it's called Haida Gwaii, uugaay, Gwii Sdiihltl'lx, and it's looking at exactly what the previous speakers are talking about in terms of community values and perspectives, and relationships, and building trust so that you can have these conversations with different people that have different interests about where to go with living with sea otters. And so the 2 key parts of the project were bringing community values and perspectives together and developing this planning tool that was the KU ecosystem model. And I'll show you a bit more about this model that is interactive, so people will be able to use a model interface and look at potential different management scenarios. And so we had a 45-person project team working together to address this, and they included co-leading with the Haida Nation and also Haida Nation representatives on the project team and other coastal First Nations and tribes who have lived with sea otters, federal and provincial agencies, the shellfish commercial industry, and then academic and research institutes and non-government organizations. And so really it was a story about people working together to address these expected and complex ecosystem changes that we expect to see as sea otters return. And so I'm going to focus mostly on the ecological stuff and not the community stuff because I don't have time. And so we built these linked ecosystem models as the tool to try and look at how we could plan and manage for the future. And so this tool is, we took data from Southeast Alaska and the Central Coast and the West Coast of Vancouver Island, working with Linda Nickel at Fisheries and Oceans, and who had the information from all of the population growth in the other areas, and also folks from Southeast Alaska and Tim Tinker, who you know, And so we brought the sea otter data together with the habitat data because the sea otter model of range expansion and population growth is dependent on how much food is in the system. And then with Dan Okamoto's work, we brought together all of the surveys that have been done for various different key species on the coast. So I'm going to show you the example of red urchins. And these dots show you where different surveys, mostly led by Fisheries and Oceans, have happened over time in BC. And so we used this data to inform what would happen when sea otters moved into the system. There are a few key places where there's a long-term data set. One of them is on the east coast of Haida Gwaii, and there's one on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and also another on the central coast where sea otters have come in. And so with that actual field data, he was able to build these relationships of how purple urchin and red urchin densities would change as sea otters increased in the ecosystem. And so we pair that with the sea otter population growth model and also with this community state transition model, which was done by a grad student of Dan Okamoto's. And so we, using the data from the west coast of Vancouver Island I just showed you with fish dynamics, used that to sort of forecast what would happen with fish as kelp forests increased as well. And so this is two examples of what this looks like in terms of the outputs of the model. So there's two examples here, one showing no coup management at all. And I didn't put the locations where otters were, like you can select the places where they first show up. These are not actually where they are, but we selected this island called Frederick Island off the west coast, and then a place here near our restoration site as the places where we have sea otters coming back to. And then you run the model however many years into the future. This would probably be about 30 years or 50 years. And then it shows you the density of otters in each of these coastal segments after, in this case, no management. And then in this case to the right, assuming that we had management around Skidegate and around Masset and around specific places that people were particularly concerned about shellfish, you get a different distribution of otters in the system if you're actually able to deter those sea otters from being in those areas. And so our hope is that this tool gets used by managers and community members to start thinking about the trade-offs that will happen as sea otters start to expand in the system. And we worked, this whole project was done remotely because of COVID. It wasn't intended that way, but we ended up with only remote meetings. And so we had this amazing graphic facilitator, Kara Sivright, who worked with us and went to the meetings and provided graphic recordings of all of the work. And then she also worked with some of the social scientists to build these scenarios based on what we think happens in ecosystems when there's no otters and then when there's unrestricted otter growth as the two extremes of what this place might look like with and without otters. And then we use these in community discussions and engagement to talk about what people valued and what the trade-offs would be and how to balance having sea otters, which everyone acknowledges should be in the ecosystem, but also we're worried about food security and about ability to access shellfish. And so because of the intertwining of the sea otter model and the population models for the different species, these are the kinds of graphs that show you the trade-offs that would be involved. So these two scenarios have no coup exclusion, so no management, versus having some exclusion in specified scenarios gives you a difference in the outcome over 50 years. And so the scales are not very good here. So I put these in bigger numbers. So this is 20 animals up here. So really, if you could manage to exclude sea otters from that coastal segment, then you'd be looking at just a handful of animals. And if you didn't exclude them, then there would be about 200 after 50 years. And then it shows you the decline that would be expected in this case, intertidal clams, into about 30 years to very few. And then if you were able to successfully keep most of the sea otters out, then you would still have a viable clam population for some food harvest. And then in terms of fish, you would get the opposite effect, where if you let the sea otters grow, then there's more kelp forests and more copper rockfish. And in this case, there would be less if you had sea otter exclusion. And so we had the same kinds of things for different key species that we were able to model. So red urchins is another one, and you can see the same trends where if there's no coup exclusion, then you expect the population of urchins to decline. And then here, the community state being kelp forest in green and urchin barren in purple, that you would have more kelp forest and less urchin barren. And just a few more pictures of, there were 4 sites around the islands with different habitats that were selected for the graphic facilitation. And so this shows before no sea otters in kind of a eelgrass and clam system, and then unrestricted sea otter growth where there's more digging. The rhizomes are mixed up. Aaron Foster did a bunch of work looking at the genetic diversity of eelgrass and has found that when there's this digging that goes on with sea otter foraging, then it causes the eelgrass to reproduce more by reproductive shoots than by cloning. And in this case, with no sea otters, most of this reproduction is by cloning. So they're all less diverse than when sea otters are around. And again, the same thing. So if you don't exclude the sea otters, then they grow in population and the clams decline. But if you manage to successfully exclude them, then you could possibly have clams for people and sea otters around. And then the same thing, this is another area called Skidegate Inlet. And there's not a lot of kelp there right now. And so this is why it looks slightly different, because we actually use data that we have on the specific areas as much as possible. And finally, because Oregon also has long beaches, we have North Beach at the north end of the island, which is kind of like the Oregon coast, but not as big. And we also have razor clams up there. And so we expect that the razor clams will become smaller and less abundant. And the crabs up there that are in the shallows, we also expect would see a decline. And so for us, now is the time to plan for how we want to live with Koo in the future. And these changes will take decades to happen. So we're at this very opportune time to be able to have these conversations before sea otters have moved in, and have them in a way that is much more measured than if the impacts were really, marked right now. So these are conversations that we've initiated over the last 3 years, but they have to continue to happen, and the relationships that we built in this project have to continue moving forward. So what we see is that, we're part of ecosystems and the solutions to today's complex issues, and we're hoping that we can continue to monitor, maintain, do research and restore these areas, and then learn and share the knowledge that we gain from restoration work, and also from places where sea otters are and have not yet returned. So that's all part of a monitoring program that we're trying to sustain with our partners. And then also working with industry to continue exploring different ways that we might be able to fish, so that we can account for what people need as well as what otters need, and coastal ecosystems. And very importantly, to continue cultivating this long-standing relationship between people and place that's focused on Haida relationships. And so, thinking about conservation and restoration elsewhere, that we have one context in Gwaii Haanas and Haida Gwaii that works for us. One size won't fit all everywhere. And so looking at individual context in terms of equity trade-offs and what sustainable use will be will depend on where you are and when these conversations take place, and the governance context that it all happens in. I think that's it. Hopefully I didn't go over time.
No, that was perfect, Lynn. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So we've already got some questions for you.
Okay. Do you want me to turn this off, like stop sharing? Is that the best thing to do, or should I leave this on?
You can stop sharing.
Okay. Oh, now how do I stop? Sorry. There's
Okay.
a new share, but here, stop share. There we go. Got it. Okay.
Yay, technology.
Yes.
Yeah, if you wanted to turn on your video, and then people can see your wonderful face. Okay, so Patricia asks, she's wondering if it would be a good idea to restore kelp the way you did before we reintroduced sea otters to Oregon. Then the otters could help stabilize the urchin population.
Oh, sorry. Do we think that we should restore kelp first?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the answer to that really, because the Oregon coast is so different than the British Columbia coast. Like, you have such a long exposed coastline, and my guess is that you probably have some remnant populations of kelp, and it's mostly bull kelp you have, right?
Yeah, we do have several strong pockets of healthy kelp up and down the
Yeah,
coast, but we do have several reefs that are pretty prevalent urchin barrens.
right.
And
In
so,
terms of otters, like I don't know where if the question is about whether it would help otters. I don't know that it would make that big a difference to otters. I think if they're gonna come in, then they'll end up eating the urchins, and then kelp will theoretically grow if there's a seed source, if there's a spore source.
okay, super. Gwen is asking, does the age of abalone affect how much they roam around to find food?
Oh, yes, it does, in the sense that once they are adults, then they need to eat kelp in order to do well. So when they're younger, you don't see much of a difference because they're eating diatoms and they're eating smaller things that are growing on the bottom. And there's not as much of a difference even between the urchin barrens and the kelp forest. But by the time they reach the age where they're eating more and more kelp in their diet, they need that food in order, and a diverse array of kelp. So I don't know which ones are the best for them. I think that was something Aaron was looking at in terms of the distribution of what kinds of kelp and seaweed they were eating. But initial work suggests that a diversity of algae, so reds and greens and kelp, is something that's good rather than just having like a monoculture food source.
Great, thank you. Donna asks, any thoughts about how to cope with hot years and warming of the ocean in this restoration area?
That that is a tough question. So we definitely saw what like we haven't causally linked it, of course, but the relationship seems to be that when we have warmer water, when kelp is recruiting, it's not good. So like for instance, this year it was cool in the spring, and so we still saw good kelp recruitment, but then it really warmed up in the summer. So I'm fully expecting with this warm summer and warm fall that next year we're going to see a crash in the kelp population. And so we'll see whether that happens or not. And if it does, then it may be related very much to the temperature of the ocean at the time when those spores are settling. And there's no easy way to cope with it because it's happening across the board. I know people are looking at genetics and looking at maybe like more heat tolerant strains of the kelps that we have here, but the work in Australia is not showing necessarily that there's a genetic link other than individual genetics. So they're not finding populations of giant kelp that are actually showing genetically different signatures than the ones that are growing that are not surviving, but that individuals themselves seem to have some ability to cope with heat. So I'm not sure if that's the case with bull kelp, but there are folks on the coast working on that project and looking at what genetics might be able to help us with.
Mm-hmm. I also, from a personal standpoint, always love watching your presentations because the graphics are always so beautiful and vibrant. I love them. Claire mentioned how she loved Kara's graphics too. So
Oh
just
yeah, yeah.
so
They're
beautiful.
amazing. Yeah, and they were amazing for us to have as just a tool for people to keep track of what was going on and what the project there's a whole other talk to like for people who are interested in terms of the process that we went through to be working with everyone on the Sea Otter project.
Oh, cool. Maybe that'll be a future presentation. Okay, we've got a two-part question for you from Andy. Lynn, would you repeat the depth range of the deeper water treatment sites versus the shallow sites?
What do you mean by that? I'm not sure I understand. So we treated the whole depth range, but when we did the work, we wanted contrast in terms of looking at the animals from the barrens versus the shallow. So when I say kelp forest, it was the urchins that were shallow against the edge of the kelp, and then when it was the barrens, it was urchins that were deeper. But in terms of the restoration work, we restored the whole area between 0 and 15 meters.
Okay. And abalone recovery in Gwaii Haanas and elsewhere in region focused on ecological recovery, or is the idea to achieve aberrantly high numbers of larger abalone to support commercial fisheries Or are there trade-offs designed to fit somewhere in between? Sorry, that may have been confusing. It's written there.
Is it written? Wait, I'm not seeing it. So
I'll send it to you, maybe.
okay. So I think I understand your question. So basically the restoration work is focused on Haida traditional fishing. So restoration of what they would call a food fishery. And so there's no, I don't think that there's any intention or ability to actually have a commercial abalone harvest again that's sustainable, because they're so easy to harvest. And because in an urchin barren situation, almost all of them are exposed and they're almost all in the shallows. So if you were to use the density of abalone that you see along the coastline from just that shallow fringe, you would possibly think there were a lot more abalone. But what happens is if you take those animals away from near the kelp, the other animals that are deeper will come and fill that space. And so then it will look like there's more abalone that can be harvested, but eventually, and it doesn't take very long, that there are no more abalone to come up from the deep because there's not very many animals down there. So it's not for commercial fishery reasons, it's to restore a traditional food fishery for the Haida.
Perfect. Great. Well, I don't see, let me make sure I'm not missing any questions in the chat. I think that is it for questions on our end. Thank you, Lynn. It's always wonderful to have you present with the Elakha Alliance. Thank you again for doing that and joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. Well, hopefully we can do a field trip to Haida Gwaii.
Yes. It's lovely.
But awesome. Is there a website or something you can share where people can follow your
Oh, yes. Well, I can send you the Haida Nation website for, hang on, I just have to dig it up. So what we did with the work is we have 2 community newsletters, and one of them is up on the website already, and another one will be soon. Here, I can show you. Can you see this?
Oh,
So it's all Kara's graphics, and then we have this lovely timeline in the middle of coexistence with Ku. So
wow.
it's a beautiful piece of work, and it won't be quite the same as a PDF, but maybe I could send one to you.
That'd be great.
Okay. I'm just looking at the website.
Sure.
And then the other thing that we've done is a reporting line, so that when people sight sea otters, they can report it and we can track where people are seeing. Okay, where are you? There we go. Okay, there's the website.
Perfect. I'm going to share it to everyone. Hold on.
Okay. Oh, yes, sorry.
I know. Zoom defaults
Hard to
on.
keep track of all these things.
I got it out to everyone. Okay, great.
Okay,
Well,
great. Thank you.
sure. Thanks so much. And we will wait 2 minutes before our next presentation.
Okay, time for coffee and